Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT. Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
The COVID-19 Transport, Travel and Social Adaptation Study started in 2020. A groundbreaking longitudinal survey in 10 areas of the UK has tracked, since the start of the pandemic, the implications for us all from COVID on how we live today. There was a recognition that COVID provided the chance for a rethink, that it would somehow reshape our lives, but back in 2020 we were not quite sure how. As the study said at its outset, the outbreak of COVID-19 was an unprecedented shock in an era of highly connected and globalised living. It was, and still is, a serious medical emergency, and also an episode we must learn from. So welcome to Transport Talks from CIHT. I'm your host, Justin Ward, and today we will be asking, from the initial COVID-19 lockdown in March 2020, what have we learnt and where do we go next? I'm joined by three experts, Professor Greg Marsden, Professor Gillian Annable, and Dr. Linus Brown, all from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds. So can we start with a personal question, starting with Greg perhaps? How has your travel behaviour changed since COVID-19?
Great question. I'd actually started working from home a bit more prior to the pandemic. I am working from home more than I was pre-pandemic, but it kind of feels like an evolution now, although obviously you remember back to 5 days a week sat at home. And what that's enabled me to do is to shift from driving, which I was doing in early 2019, to getting the bus generally. So a couple of days a week I get the CityZap bus from York to Leeds. It's a longer journey, but it works for me because I only do it a couple of times a week. We've sold a car in the family, and we do a lot more things online, and I think some of that is just stuff that we learned to do during the pandemic that we just carried on doing.
I had sort of similar experience in the sense of actually scrapping a car, but maybe I'll touch on that later. But Gillian, how have things changed for you during the kind of experience of the last few years?
I would say the biggest change has been with respect to business travel, i.e., going to face-to-face meetings, conferences, etc. And it's actually, for me, and I've heard this said by other people, it's not just the fact that I'm doing a lot less of it. It's that I really don't want to do it. and I've sort of reevaluated all of that and realised that so much of it is not an efficient use of time. That's not to say there aren't some types of events that are really still useful and that I do want to do face to face, but there's an awful lot that can actually be done much more efficiently and effectively online, as far as I'm concerned. So that's the biggest change. And then from a personal perspective, I am a COVID cliche. I got a dog during lockdown. So that means that my amount of walking obviously has increased, but walking in my case, walking for leisure travel. But that means then that a lot of my leisure time is walking. I want to go out walking with the dog at weekends, and so I'm just doing a lot more of that at the expense of zipping off and doing other types of leisure. So yeah.
Interesting. So the pandemic puppy was a theme for you, yeah. And Linus, how about yourself in terms of changes in movements over the last few years?
So I'm not going to talk about commuting because I only started at the Institute for Transport Studies in February 2020. So I was still trying to work out what my commuting pattern was going to look like, because I live in Manchester. So I was still trying to juggle what my commute might look like and how often I'd go into Leeds. So definitely working from home, I think a lot more than what I'd thought I would when I took on this post. But maybe sort of covering the other aspects, I definitely go to the shops, I think, a lot less frequently than I used to. So kind of doing the sort of large grocery shops not as frequently, and trying to just not use any sort of vehicles and maybe go on my bike and walk as much as I can. Partly, I think, because I'm working from home and I just want to be outside a bit more, taking advantage of sort of going to the little local shops a bit more frequently than I used to do.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so those are the personal reflections. I guess if we could expand it out to the study to look at the kind of wider societal impacts of things, it's a really fascinating study, and it was an interesting choice to undertake it. But Greg, could you see what was the kind of reason for deciding to embark on this study, and kind of what were some of the sort of structuring elements to it? And then we'll go into the findings a bit more after.
Well, I suppose probably we'd have to wind back to 2011 when I was involved in a project with Gillian and various other academic colleagues called Disruption, and that was a project that came out of the energy program. And our pitch was that instead of trying to understand a sort of incremental change, we should look at what happens during big moments of change or disruption and see how much adaptive capacity people have. So we looked at things like the Olympics in 2012, which is obviously a well-planned event. We've looked at the closure of the Forth Road Bridge, flooding events, snow and ice, and we did various scenarios. So we'd kind of developed a bank of tools and a set of understandings that kind of made us think that, you know, we were onto something. I have to say, not well received by policymakers who thought the idea of talking about disruption was just like, go away, that's politically difficult. Not well received by the research community who thought that, well, you know, we had feedback. What could this tell us? Why would this be any use for understanding potential future environmental policies? So I think there was a kind of a motivation to say, look, we think we've got something that can help here. And I had a look back through my emails. It was the 18th of March when emails started flying around about could we get some emergency funding from the Research Council, so 5 days before lockdown. And well, Gillian was the mastermind of the longitudinal online survey, and I worked with, obviously supporting that, but worked with Ian Doherty also on talking to policymakers about what they understood at the time, because the other side of this is it really easy to forget, like even now when you think what was March 2020 like, what were we doing, what were we thinking, so having that kind of opportunity, and Linos did this with the public as well, actually at that point in time, what did it feel like, how uncertain were you, what did you think you were going to do next? So I think we kind of knew it was going to be a long game, even though we didn't get funding for the long game. We got given a shred of money to get the surveys off the ground. Then we gave up our weekends, evenings and days to making it happen, maybe.
Gillian, the findings were described, it would be good to hear what the findings were, but described, I thought it was an intriguing way that they were modest but also extraordinary. And in what sense they covered both of those things, because they feel quite polar opposite in a way. So maybe what the findings were, but also what made that expression come to life.
I think this is really important, actually, and it's the nub of what we're trying to understand and demonstrate here. So when you think about trying to change travel behaviour, often what you're doing is repeat cross-sectional surveys, and you look at the average, you know, the proportion of trips undertaken by car or average levels of car ownership, and you don't see very much change often in the average. But underneath that average, often there's all kinds of switches in all kinds of different directions that then add up together to make that average. And some of those switches aren't huge, as in big numbers, 10% swings, 20% swings. They might only be 2 or 3% shift towards zero car households, for instance. But the point is that we do a lot of talking about the idea that people can't change, they won't change, it's all only going in one direction. And so to show some of these changes in pockets of society under certain conditions going in the direction that we're trying to achieve, however small, still demonstrates that it can happen. And often we just haven't looked at those types of pockets of change before. So that's what we're doing. And as we talked about some of the results, we can give you some examples of that kind of shift that we're seeing.
And in terms of the findings, Linos, could you just give us an outline of where we saw, I think maybe some of this was indicated perhaps maybe pandemic puppies increased walking rates, but that was kind of one of the sort of findings, wasn't it? But in terms of other modes and how people moved, perhaps casting minds back to lockdown and how things tracked over time, because it is, as restrictions have been lifted and people are now living in a different world to some degree, then things have kind of settled back. So kind of tracking over that duration of time, what's happened and where are we at now?
So I think the point that Greg raised before about kind of remembering what time points we're at is kind of really important when we kind of talk about some of our results. So with our survey, so far we've done 4 surveys and they cover 5 different time points. So we've got the before, the during the lockdown, October 2020, June 2021, and then now June 2022. And I was looking back and kind of trying to work out, when did we live in this world of no restrictions? And I thought it was a while ago, but it was only sort of March 2022 this year. So I think in terms of some of the findings that are coming out, it's still worth putting them into context, that people are still trying to work out what this sort of post-pandemic life might look like and what their post-pandemic travel is going to look like. And that's going to be really important for us going forward in other future survey waves. But focusing on what we have found out and what we're sort of looking at so far, I think one of the sort of key things to sort of point out is that motorised traffic isn't back to what it was pre-pandemic. People are starting to go back to work, or people are maybe seeing roads are busier and things like that. But in terms of kind of the people using the car as a driver and a car as a passenger frequently, so we're defining that as at least 3 days a week, we can still see that that's at about 90% of pre-pandemic levels. That's really important when we start thinking about reductions in sort of car use post-pandemic. The general things about public transport I don't think will be any sort of surprise to sort of people listening. Public transport isn't back to sort of pre-pandemic levels, and we're seeing that at about 45 to 60% of what it used to be. And we can see that the frequency of bus use is kind of increasing at a faster rate than people sort of going back and using the train. So there's kind of some clear differences going on there between people using buses regularly and the train regularly. Like you said, walking, we've seen increases over time from our survey, and at the most recent survey wave we've seen that sort of stabilise. So it'll be really interesting sort of the future waves to see what's going on there. And cycling, we've not seen that come back at pre-pandemic levels either, but maybe it's worth sort of bringing in some sort of earlier findings that we did for some of the previous waves where we kind of focused on working from home, where we did find that people working from home were at that point of time, which I think was in the October 2020 survey, that those working from home were more likely to commute by bike or train. So looking at this most recent survey, which will be the first one that we've conducted with no restrictions, we're going to be looking at what's going on with working from home a little bit more and trying to see how did those people previously commute, and are they still more likely to be commuting by train and bike, and does that explain some of the mode figures that we're seeing in terms of frequencies?
I can just come in on that just now. I think Linos's stats there give us a great example of the statement that you were talking with Gillian about modest but extraordinary. And if you look at where we've got to in terms of overall road traffic, as Linos said, our survey showing 10% plus people not using the car 3 days a week reduction. You look at the total impact on road traffic during the working week, it's about 93% of pre-pandemic levels. And the number of conferences I've been to where people have said things have got back to normal, and I just want to scream, because in any other world, if we delivered a 7% reduction in weekday traffic, people would have thought we'd come up with some kind of magic wand, show me a smart motorway intervention or any behavior change intervention that's ever delivered anything on that scale. It's enormous. It's only 7%, but the commute is only 20% of all of our journeys. But the fact that that's persisted is hugely significant. So kind of modest, but absolutely extraordinary.
This is this disruption argument that you were facing, where why would we want to look at disruptions many years ago? Then we faced one of the biggest disruptions to our lives. I mean, it kind of brings to wider challenges, I guess, in the wider environmental space in terms of action to reduce emissions linked to obviously climate change. And Gillian, I know you've focused on this a lot. I mean, where do you feel that the transport sector is at in terms of taking the lessons from experience of mobility patterns during COVID to kind of lock them in? I think there's that 7%, but is that there's obviously more required, and are you feeling optimistic at the moment or not so much?
Like Greg, I find myself getting incredibly grumpy when I'm hearing discussions about this, because either we're hearing, well, traffic's back to normal, the pandemic made no difference whatsoever, and as Greg has just said, it's not back to normal. And even where you start to see maybe some graphs saying that car traffic is back to almost the same level as pre-pandemic levels, that's not during the peak time. And what's happened is there's been a shift. There's been a reduction during peak hours. There has been an increase in car use at weekends. Now, these things are really significant. They're not things that are going, some of those things aren't going in the right direction, but we still need to acknowledge that there's an awful lot of change and we're not back to normal. So that's the first principle, is that things have changed, things can change. And in the context of the science, the modelling that we've done, many people have done at different scales and so on, saying that we can't achieve our carbon reduction targets without significant reductions in car use. It can't just be all on changing the powertrain. It has to be in tandem with reductions, particularly over the next 10 years. Then we have to take this very seriously and stop hand waving as though we think we know what's going on out there, because we don't. And then the other thing that happens is the other extreme, where people say, oh, it's fine, everybody's working from home now. Well, no, everybody's not working from home by any stretch of the imagination. And even if they were working from home, our focus on the commute is part of why we're in the mess that we're in, because it is only at best a fifth of the travel that we do. So it's just these, real extremes that people jump to. Either we can't do it, or, if only we did this, it'd be fine. None of those things are true. And this is why this kind of real disaggregated analysis and really trying to break down against different journey purposes, but also lifestyles that have packages of car owning, commuting, shopping, childcare. What does that look like, and how is that changing across all of those different activities? That's the only way we are going to have sophisticated conversations and then make policy off of the back of that.
And Linos, can we go back to the kind of breakdown of different areas and different socioeconomic groups? Because that's one point about this, it's just a sort of homogeneous kind of discussion. There's obviously differences in different areas, and that all impacts on different aspects of how we travel, working from home, online deliveries. What were some of the differences in the areas that were studied? Because it was research done in Scotland, England, and so on. So what were kind of some of the aspects to that?
Something that we've sort of found is the difference in geographies, basically, and the different pictures that are going on across England and Scotland. So as you said, we looked at 10 different locations across England and Scotland, and maybe just focusing on sort of car ownership as one example. So as Gillian mentioned, we're able to kind of track changes over time at sort of like an individual level of what households have increased the number of cars in the household, which households have decreased their cars, who's gone from no car households to 1 or 2 cars in their household, and things like this. And when we kind of look at as a raw figure and averages over time, we can see that the average number of cars per household has reduced over time. But there's some clear differences going on across England and Scotland in the places that we've looked at. There's some places, such as like Bristol and Glasgow, where we've actually seen an increase in the average number of cars per household, but then all of our other locations have seen a decrease. But then the rates of decrease vary again between locations. When we also look at how fast maybe each sort of mode of travel is kind of recovering in the different locations, we can also see differences there. So for example, Aberdeen, we saw car use recovering the most rapidly in Aberdeen compared to some other areas. So there's some interesting things going on at sort of more regional level and local level that we have been looking at. I'm not sure if Greg and Gillian can remember any other ones off the top of your head.
I think one of the key ones that stood out in my mind was the people who weren't able to work from home tended to live in more disadvantaged areas on the edges of the city. They had slightly shorter car-based commutes, but they were heavily car-based commutes. So I think this obviously it's got significant equity issues that are playing out right now, because these are the people who are having to continue to travel to work. They can't avoid increased fuel prices. They don't have a meaningful public transport alternative. So one thing we've learned from disruption is it also reveals like vulnerabilities in the people who are having to try and continue to make their journeys. So that stands out as really important to us. We weren't able to find anything about like the attributes of places. It wasn't like, well, I've got great broadband and I live near a park, so therefore I prefer to work from home more. Basically, people were working from home because they were instructed to work from home. So there wasn't the kind of this dash to the rural areas that people talked about. We didn't see any of that. That's not to say some of these things won't play out in a kind of longer term sorting arrangement as people work from home, look for different things in their housing. But it's surprisingly static compared to some of the stuff that you might see in the newspapers. Rightmove or whoever found more searches in this area than that area in 1 week. We just didn't see that over time, and again, that's the value of the longitudinal part.
Yeah, it was the rush to Dorset, wasn't it? The coastal areas where everyone was fleeing the cities, and that sort of seemed to be a temporary headline for a bit. I was going to ask about this assumption that's maybe played for a long time on, and we've got a current political focus on growth, and that assumption of growth and the links between transport and growth, in the sense that there's kind of a decoupling that's maybe been going on for some time, but maybe that decoupling between growth and transport is kind of really, the pandemic kind of drew a wedge between that a bit more abruptly. But I don't know, kind of views on that in terms of what it means for forecasting and modelling schemes. Maybe Greg, kind of views on that.
I suppose I'd start by saying I'm deeply concerned that's all just been put to one side in the current kind of thinking about, well, roads will lead to growth, right? I mean, in a sense, what this has revealed is that it's like the wrong exam question. The question is, how do we have a productive economy? How does a knowledge economy work, and what's the role of transport in that? And what the pandemic revealed was actually, although at the time it was happening and everyone was being asked to work from home, that wasn't great. But what we've ended up with is some kind of sorting where people are working from home a lot more. That seems to be a preference. Businesses seem to be able to cope with that. So actually what we had was people wasting time on the roads that they didn't really want to be spending making those journeys to conduct work. And I think we need to open that thinking out a lot broader as well. So Thenos gave her example of living in Manchester and working in Leeds. If I think about the people that I've been able to employ over the last couple of years and where they live and how often we interact physically versus virtually, it opens up labour markets. I ran a research network where we were supposed to be having face-to-face meetings for 3 years, and it was almost entirely during the pandemic. It's been far more inclusive in terms of who's been able to participate in the network. So the knowledge economy across the north where we were running it has been much more integrated as a result of these online opportunities. So I just think we need to re-ask the questions about why we're assuming that the value is in the journey. And I think there are things to be learned. I'm not a specialist economist, but Ian Doherty, who we work with, has been looking at the kind of productivity angle on some of this. There's a lot more to look at.
Anything to add to that, Gillian or Linos?
Well, I agree. I think our Less is More report that we produced earlier this year, so that was based on the first 3 waves of the survey, was entitled Less is More, precisely to capture this idea that we can do as much, if not more stuff, productive stuff in the economy, but with less physical travelling. And the examples in there, obviously, of course, we focused on working from home, but we also focused on shopping as well, another obvious one. when you look at just the economy-wide figures on spend in supermarkets, that was not dented during the pandemic, but an awful lot less travelling to supermarkets has taken place and has, to a large extent, continued on. So there has been a reduction in online supermarket purchasing from our survey compared to right at the sort of peak during the pandemic, but it's still much higher than it was pre-pandemic. So it's that kind of thing, looking at those productive elements. But I also think, obviously, there are places and people for whom more travel would mean more inclusivity and more productivity. And that comes back to what we were saying earlier about those people who can't work from home, who are doubly disadvantaged, if not triply disadvantaged. They don't have the choice to work from home. They tend to live in places that are further away from their workplace, so active travel is often not an option, and they are often on the end of a bus network if they have one at all, and so they're sort of forced more into car ownership, and that's forcing them often into transport poverty, so having to spend a lot more on just trying to keep a car going in order to go to work, etc. And it's, so it's that's where we're going to spend and invest in the transport system. There are ways in which we can do that to lead to economic growth and better social outcomes, but it's not a given that spending on the transport system will lead to productivity and economic growth.
Yeah, there was that sense that COVID was the great equalizer. I think that myth was quickly expelled with the kind of particularly the pressures in groups and the higher rates of infections and deaths in groups where they were having to still go out and so on, whereas not everyone experienced it the same way, certainly, and continues to experience it differently. The report, obviously it's still going, so there's a kind of capturing moment. There's things like, in terms of recommendations, and for you, from each of you, from this experience, this new sort of post-pandemic new paradigm of mobility, what do you think are the kind of key aspects in policy terms that you think are key in terms of recommendations or lessons that you would take from this that you think are worth highlighting? Maybe start with Gillian.
Okay, a couple of things, and these really are top of the mind. I know I'm going to go away and think, oh, that would have been more my priority area. But so one thing would be going back to what I was talking about sort of overall traffic levels and car traffic levels, and sort of thinking that we're back to normal. We're not back to normal, and one of the things that is potentially happening is a greater use of the car at weekends for leisure travel. So this is something I've been banging the drum about for a very long time. But long distance journeys, which are largely, or a large majority of those miles we travel by car on those longer distance trips, are for leisure journeys. This kind of work, as well as just our age-old National Travel Survey figures that show where most miles are consumed and therefore carbon, is pointing to these longer distance leisure trips. And I think we need to think about that. I think there is discussion with train companies, for instance, the degree to which it's at all realistic to think about not a total reorientation, but some kind of way of reorienting their products, their services, to try and capture this kind of activity. So that's one area that I'd like to see this work and other work think about the implications for policy and what we could do there. The other thing is in relation to what we were talking about in terms of social exclusion, and really having a targeted approach, both targeted socially but also targeted in terms of place-based approach. Where are these pockets of exclusion? We managed to identify them with quite, scarce resource and so on. We added spatial data to our participants, and we could see the patterning, and that could be done much more standard, really understanding where are these pockets of people in certain types of jobs, at the end of bus routes, etc., where the prospects for commuting to work and going out and finding work could actually be improved in a much more targeted fashion. So there's two. As I say, I know that I'll think about this.
No, that's interesting. I'd like to just, before we turn to the others, the point about the rail industry is interesting one, and the kind of this range of different tickets. There's a big question, I think, also about the financial viability of public transport now. It's being challenged massively in how to keep things running, as well as also making them attractive to people in terms of clear pricing and so on. So maybe a little bit on that, and then also one question about that. I know demand responsive transport sort of has been around for a while, but do you see that as a possible solution in terms of that kind of access to jobs, particularly for various groups of people? There's a degree of stress in terms of the costs of running their own private vehicles. So just a couple of thoughts on that, and then we'll turn to the others for their kind of key takeaways.
If it's okay to pass the buck on the rail ticketing question, just because I know Greg has actually been speaking to rail operators and probably has more sensible things to say on that. I think on the demand responsive transport, I certainly believe, whether it's for the people that I've been mentioning in terms of being socially excluded, forced into car ownership, or whether it's actually just looking more generally at what we're finding in particular around car ownership. And there is this the greatest movement we've seen is from 2-car households down to 1, which is one of these modest but extraordinary changes, I would say. And in all those cases, the discussion around demand responsive transport, around different models of owning and accessing cars, is really relevant.
That shift maybe in mobility and how people, that kind of assumption of car ownership suddenly gets challenged. Actually, you can access different mobility. Because I said at the start, just briefly, about my car, they talk about disruptions. The car breaks, head gasket blows. Suddenly the car's good for nothing else but the scrap heap. And live in London, but that means that now we're thinking, well, actually, do we need a car? Can we get around other ways? And challenging that on a personal level. So wasn't necessarily the COVID disruption that broke that link, severed the link between car ownership and how we move about. It was more the car collapse, but it still does make you challenge that. I think seeing that there's different options and doing things, I think maybe it's that pause that COVID caused that maybe caused the reflection more generally about how we do things. So I think having those service models, though, that's maybe the challenge, a bit like the ticketing thing that when people ask Greg for a bit more information on, how developed those markets are for offering different service mobility. I think those maybe it's still more to understand that from a consumer perspective, to actually know what's out there and be informed to make choices about going, actually, we don't actually need to own a car anymore. And I think that's, for me, is a kind of key question at the moment that people maybe are starting to think about. If anything you wanted to add to what you were saying, but maybe go to Greg next and sort of key takeaways. But maybe before we do that, just the bit about the rail sector and all the myriad of pricing and models and other things, and even the viability of the rail industry. No small question, Greg. So good luck with that.
Thanks for that. I think, Gillian, that's called a hospital pass. But I treat bus and rail as quite different. And in particular, like the quantum of money that went into the rail sector relative to the bus sector was huge. And I think with bus funding in particular, it serviced a lot more socially necessary journeys than the rail industry during the pandemic. And as Lena said, it's picked up a bit more, even where it's at like 80-90% of pre-pandemic patronage, that's huge. We're already seeing service cuts in different places. In a sense, what the government did was to demonstrate that it understood the value of public transport to key workers. And then what we're ending up doing by letting things kind of drift away and atrophy of services is we're undermining the resilience of those services that key workers rely on. So were we to have next year another wave that required lockdown, and I don't think that's likely, but as a thought experiment, we'd be in a much worse place now in terms of the services that are available to people. So I would like to see that the social value of the bus is something that really the department should, I think, be reviewing and trying to understand the case for subsidy. It's not the same case for subsidy that it was pre-pandemic. I think we do need to think about that. And obviously rail is difficult. What the pandemic revealed was that our markets they only work within the parameters which you imagine the market is going to work, and so clearly none of the companies could take the revenue risk, so it's all ended up coming back to government. What's the rail, what is rail there for? We're not going to get back to the same type of commuting patterns. We're not going to get back to the same level of business travel, as Gillian was saying earlier. Those were the big money making markets for the rail industry. But also, what were we spending our money on? Like capacity enhancements to get ever more trains into more difficult and constrained stations. A rethink of the profile of what we're spending our money on. But I think if we're going to go for a system which is less peaky and more focused towards leisure journey or a more even pattern of services across the week, that's got a subsidy ticket to it. And again, I think the focus has been on the numbers and not the purpose and the value of doing it. And I think that's why other European countries have probably done better, because they've just had a long-term view about what rail is for in their economy, and therefore they've been able to justify different approaches to subsidy and encouraging people back to rail and so on. Linos can probably share some interesting numbers about decline in season ticket sales, which was happening before, has been accelerated. But yeah, I just think we need to have a bit more of a rethink about a reset about what the rail system for the next 10 or 20 years is going to service. The commute market isn't dead. There's lots of busy commute trains still, but it's just not going to be the same market that it was before.
Well, thank you very much. That's interesting. The kind of key takeaways, policy points, just to put that question back as well. What for you would be the kind of key headlines that you'd like that you felt in terms of recommendations from the work so far that you think are key? Is it around that rail aspect, or is it that rail aspect and other elements?
I've already spent a bit of time on that, so maybe I'll pick another one and give myself an opportunity to talk about something else. I think a kind of non-policy policy is corporate social responsibility and business travel. All these companies are committed to net zero targets. Like, now is the time to really try and embed those business travel practices in a different way to encourage people to experiment more. I think if we don't do that, that's a massive missed opportunity. I know we are at the university here, but other places will be too. And the thing that's frustrated me most is we haven't had a proper kind of work from home commute zero kind of package. How do we actually lock in the best of that benefit, taking into account domestic heating, workplace heating, the whole benefit system? How bonkers was it about what you're allowed to have at home in order to support your working pattern or whatever, without it being classed as a benefit? And we just need to rethink. If we're actually accepting we've got a hybrid working economy, then we need a set of tax benefits and incentives and payments that are reflective of that. And I don't think that works at all. I think again, if we leave it too long, we'll have missed the opportunity to save the emissions, and the focus will be somewhere else.
Okay, thank you. Season tickets then, Linos, and then you'll kind of rethink what from all of this work, what would be the rethink that you think is required?
In our recent survey, we did ask about season tickets and parking permits and what's going on with people who are working from home some or all of the time. And we can see that, we've got about 10 to 15% of the sort of working sample that are working from home at some point of their working week have said that they've given up buying their season tickets. We still need to have a look at how they're commuting to see if they're still commuting by a train or a bus, and then just try and look at, if they still are, what ticket options would they potentially be looking at. But then we can also see about 5 to 10% of those people as well have given up parking permits. So there's definitely some change that is happening. But I think the big thing with working from home is that we read quite a lot in the media. Some of these big companies are saying they're going to stop working from home, we're going to go back to the office. It's really important to remember that, as I said earlier on, the restrictions, we've only been in a kind of world, UK without restrictions since March 2022, March this year. And people are still trying to work out what this dynamic of working from home and hybrid working is going to look like. Workplaces are still working out policies, but they're still trying to work out all these sort of dynamics of what works best for that employee and also for the business. And going back to our points that Greg made about the kind of mad dash to like the countryside and things like that, until these policies are in place, moving house is a massive decision for somebody. Is somebody going to be making a quick decision unless they know that their workplace is potentially going to be supporting them working from home? So I think some of these headlines that we're seeing about working from home, they're still to be decided. And I don't think we're going to find some of the answers to these in our most recent survey, but in the surveys over the next year that we'll continue sort of looking at these topics, that's going to be something that's going to come out a bit more as to what's happening with working from home and this sort of dynamic of how much somebody is working from home or traveling to work, and what are we reverting back to and what is sort of changing for a sort of more longer term. And what was the other question?
No, it was it was the key kind of things that made you rethink in terms of what the findings were, and from the recommendations that are emerging from the study, what for you were the most important ones?
I think there's maybe two things in terms of our findings sort of point to, or sort of opportunities that are happening or could be happening now. And I think one of those is to prioritise walking. We have seen great that there's now a hierarchy of road users in the updated highway code, but let's kind of implement this. And I'm not talking about massive brand new infrastructures and things like that. Let's just maintain the things that we've got. So making pavements, clearing pavements, cutting hedgerows back, making sure the lighting works, putting benches in to make walking accessible to everybody, because speak to people that are elderly and some of them are locked in the house because they want to go to the shops, but they need to have a rest and there's nowhere to have a rest. So I think some of these things are quite basic things that we could be doing, like looking at dropped curbs and drainage that wouldn't take massive costs, but it would encourage people to explore their local area a bit more, maybe not jump in their car and drive somewhere else that's nicer, for example. And also then we've got these wider sort of health and well-being benefits that I think are often forgotten about when we talk about transport. We talk about cost savings or time saving, but also there's this element of the satisfaction of a journey that's been undertaken, and also the wider health benefits or implications of undertaking that journey, which I think it would be great to kind of see those a bit more prioritised, especially because we've seen an increase in walking and seeing that sort of continuing. And the other thing I think I'd like to see is a bit more sort of joined up messaging and a sort of joined up approach to, what are we trying to tell the members of the public here? I've sort of done some other work alongside this with some focus groups in Scotland, and people sort of highlighted there that one minute, they're having messages from the government about trying to reduce their car travel in Scotland, but then they turn the telly on and they're confronted with adverts for SUVs and cheap holidays, and they know that the reason to reduce car use is because of this trying to decarbonise and reduce emissions, but then they're being faced by all of these sort of adverts on telly about cheap holidays, which they know flying's worse than driving a car. And you can take that message into other areas, like we talked earlier about business travel is going to have changed massively due to the pandemic. And one of the things, like Greg mentioned, is it would be great to see businesses try and look at more sustainable travel options for their staff. But then alongside that, we can see the cuts to services and cuts to trains and cuts to buses, which doesn't facilitate and make those choices easy. So it's kind of this joined up messaging at all levels, really, that I think I would like to see, and I think would be worth kind of seeing in the future, especially given the changes that have happened during the pandemic. This is a great opportunity to kind of do that.
So finally, just where can people go for information on the study so far, if you want to find out more information?
Everything that we've produced can be looked at via the CREDS, the Centre on Research for Energy Demand Solutions website. That takes you to the Transas study, where we've produced the reports, we've got blogs, we've tried to do little vignettes on some of the earlier findings, wave 4 findings, the latest findings. aren't up there yet, but watch this space and they will be. So that's www.creds.ac.uk, and you can get to it from there. If you put in Transas, TRANSAS, into the search engine, either at the Creds website or Google, you'll get to what we've produced.
Great, and we'll put those links on the show notes for the podcast as well. All I need to do now is thank all of you so much for your time today and for sharing the work so far. That was an interview with Professor Greg Marston, Professor Gillian Annable, and Dr. Linos Brown from the Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds.
Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.